Hello there, sir.
Well, good evening, Ron. How are you this evening?
I'm excited. It's almost Christmas.
It is just
Probably
a
my
week.
second favorite time of the year besides Halloween. But what's so cool about this show tonight is we get to crash two different traditions into one. Although this has been a tradition for a long time, the idea of telling ghost stories
Ghost
around
stories at
Christmas.
Christmas.
Yeah. So whenever I was a kid, I used to listen to the song, chestnuts roasting on an open fire, right? I can
Hmm.
understand that, right? I can understand chestnuts. Friends come a calling, kids are singing. And then there's this incredible line at the end that says, and telling ghost stories. Like, what the heck's up with that? So the more I researched this, the more I found out that this was a tradition around the Christmas season for years and years, maybe for a millennia, as a matter of fact. And then it was just recently, within the past 100 years or so, coming out of fashion. But if you look at the works of Shakespeare's A Winter's Tale, by the way, it says that this is the best time of the year to talk about ghosts and goblins.
It absolutely is. One of the reasons for that, I think, is because, when we did our episode, a couple months back on Samhain and Halloween, we talked about the fact that it was the old pagan New Year, and it was the time when they believed that the veil between the worlds was stretched to its thinnest, and that ghosts could travel back and forth. It was the dark of the year, but the dark of the year lasted right from Halloween right through to the winter solstice, because the winter solstice is the time of the rebirth of the sun. The sun begins to grow in strength again, and a lot of ancient peoples believed that during this entire darkest, coldest part of the year, that the powers of darkness were still at large. And so this whole time was kind of a time of darkness, and a time when the fear of ghosts and potentially the fear of death, because winter was a time of death, was very common, and it was right there in people's consciousness. So I think it really became a part of the Christmas time tradition. It's a way to remind yourselves that not only are the dark forces out there, but at Christmas time, you've got the light to look forward to. So it was kind of that bridge into the time of light.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point because when we were talking about the bonfires of Halloween, this was in preparation for the slow returning of the sun, which is going to be happening here in just a couple of days.
Yeah, it's the return of the sun. And so, by the way, before we get any farther into it, because we just launched right into it here, folks, I do want to welcome everybody who's out there, in the viewing audience, and thanks again for coming back. I want to also just a little shout out to anybody who doesn't get to watch it live. Hi, Mary Beth, how are you? Good to have you back. Who doesn't get to watch it live? There's also the fact that, of course, you can always watch this again on YouTube, and for those of you who are watching after the fact, we're still happy to have you. Those watches always help us. Give us a like, give us a thumbs up, and subscribe if you're not already subscribed, because we love to see you folks back here, on a weekly basis. And I was about to say on Monday Night Monsters, but you may have caught this. I threw it up for a few moments at the beginning, is that we're going to go through a kind of a level up here. We're going through a little evolution, and we have decided that from this point forward, we are going to be Monday Night Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters. And this is going to allow us to sort of spread our wings a little bit, and explore some topics that are a little bit less specifically focused on monsters and more focused on the greater world of everything from mysterious stories, lost civilizations, interesting literature, a little bit of everything. It gives us some room to grow, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun going forward. And tonight is in a lot of ways the inauguration of that, because Ron, you were saying, just as we are mashing up two of our favorite topics, ghosts and Christmas, we're also mashing up this new concept where we're going to be exploring a work of literature and a lot of the history of the literature itself, not necessarily all just the spooky aspects.
Right. And I think that, besides Charlie Brown reading from, or, the Linus's little take on the Gospel of Luke, this is probably the second best known piece of literature during the Christmas season.
I think it certainly is. And of course, in case you did not, look at the ticker coming in, you should know that what we're doing this evening is "Oh Haunted Night: The Ghostly History of Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol." We figured that was a great way to enter into Christmas week here. Getting ready next Sunday for the big night. And so we hope you guys are going to enjoy this. It is definitely one of my favorite works of fiction of all time. I'm a huge fan of A Christmas Carol. In fact, I have here This is a facsimile edition of the original edition. So this is the same size, shape, the binding, the gilded edges, all the original illustrations and everything in here. Let's see if I can flip through fast enough to get one of these for you. Let's see. Preface, who knows? Well, I can tell you that this is meant to be a perfect reproduction of Charles Dickens' original Christmas Carol. I'm doing a terrible job showing this off here. You can see how good I am with the camera, but this is one of my favorite possessions, and I love to read this every single year. It's exactly the way it was published back in 1843, when A Christmas Carol was first released. Now, you were telling me, Ron, right before we jumped on earlier, that you have a little bit more of a personal connection with A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, you know what? I don't want to brag or anything like that, but back in my younger, wilder days, I was known as a bit of a thespian. And I was able to bring Mr. Fezziwig to life on stage for the Hobnob Theater production of A Christmas Carol.
All right. Mr. Fezziwig, of course, always a great character, the sort of jolly, bumbling Mr. Fezziwig. We'll talk a little bit about him this evening. But hopefully some of you folks out here have read Charles Dickens' original novella. It's not exactly a novel. It's a novella, A Christmas Carol. And if not, I have to assume that you've seen some of the many adaptations of it over the years. But just a little quick background on The Christmas Carol itself. It was written, as I mentioned a moment ago, in 1843, and it is one of the most beloved works of fiction, not just Christmas fiction, but fiction in general in the English language. And it's a book which completely redefined the celebration of Christmas. And really, I do think forever, even though maybe premature because the end of time hasn't quite gotten here yet, but it very much redefined the celebration of Christmas. One of the things you have to understand in 1843 was that Christmas was not a particularly popular holiday at that time. In the late 1600s, the Puritans, who at that time were in charge of parliamentary England, had banned Christmas. And they thought that it was a licentious holiday where people drank and reveled and got up to all sorts of no good. They believed that the symbols of Christmas were symbols of paganism, and so they banned Christmas outright. And it was only banned for a few decades. But when it was, by the time Christmas was no longer banned, at least a generation had passed and people had grown out of the custom of the big celebrations. And it really became a fairly low-key, unimportant holiday, an observance. It was mostly just a religious church holiday for the next couple centuries. And it didn't come back for a very long time.
Yeah, you know what? That's a fantastic point, because I think the ultimate Scrooge here has to be Oliver Cromwell, because he disliked anything that came with any kind of pagan trappings or Catholicism or anything like that. And, it lasted in England, stripping the churches even of any kind of color or ornamentation. And this is the idea of the purifying of the religion. And by the time it gets to New England, I know that in Boston, you would actually have to pay a fine if you were caught decorating on Christmas or singing Christmas carols. It was just another work day, as a matter of fact. And the other thing we have to point out too is the way Christmas was actually celebrated. It wasn't celebrated like we do nowadays. It was almost like if you were celebrating Lent. This was a time of confession, making oneself right with God, a time of abstinence, and a time of fasting. So it was a completely different thing. And to show how unimportant Christmas was in America, the first time Congress ever met was on Christmas Day. So it took a while before this finally caught on. And one of the places that it did kind of not so much catch on, but kind of reignite was in the churches. We can find in the mid 1700s churches around Jamestown, Virginia, starting to decorate a little bit. Starting to put some of the greenery back in again. That was customary, in churches. So you see this return to the past because people wanted it. Right? I mean, we really do need some sort of symbolic representation for what's going on, because at the heart of the matter, most of these people were farmers. This was midwinter, which is always kind of strange because the first day of summer and the first day of winter is called midwinter or midsummer because it's halfway. Exactly right. So midwinter, if you're a farmer, you know that you're halfway to the planting season, right? So we're halfway done. Pretty soon we're going to be back in the fields. The earth is going to be alive again. And this is something to look forward to. So by the church using greenery and coming back in, it was a continuation that we've been practicing since pagan times, this memory that this darkness and this cold is not going to last forever.
And it's a time that I think that people needed a celebration. They needed a little bit
Absolutely.
of a sort of a bit of hope going forward, and that's very much what sort of the secular Christmas has become, is a season of hope. One of the things that we always do on this channel, we try to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible. We talk about a lot of different traditions, a lot of different faiths, and we both are very well aware that that this season is not simply about Christmas, and that you have Hanukkah, you have Yule, you have Diwali, you have so many different festivals from different cultures around this time of year. But one of the things I've always loved about Christmas, not being Christian myself, one of the things I've always loved about Christmas is that Christmas is a holiday for families. It's a holiday for togetherness, for joy, and that the secular aspects of Christmas, even though the name itself is Christian in origin, can be applied to anyone. And so there's no reason that a person of any tradition can't celebrate that sort of winter joy. And I think that it's nice that it brings us together.
Yeah.
But we have a lot to go through tonight, so I'm going to kind of push us into our sort of central topic, because I know you and I, we could go on just on that topic alone. We could probably go on for a solid hour. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Charles Dickens, the author of A Christmas Carol, because knowing a little bit about Mr. Dickens, I think will help us to understand the story. Charles Dickens was, first of all, he was a very enigmatic man. He was a temperamental genius. He was known to be incredibly difficult to work with, but because his work was so exemplary and he was so popular, publishers worked with him when they could, and he went through a few publishers in his time. He was a champion of the poor and downtrodden, but in his personal life, he could be extremely frivolous, sometimes ridiculously so, and this got him into some pretty intense financial distress a little bit later in his career. He took great joy in the fames his book brought him. He did book tours, he did speeches, he was constantly traveling, but he also detested the public spotlight and the toll that it took on him. So he was a man of extremes, and he was a man who was both loved and by some people hated, just because he was a monster to work with. Not an unpleasant man, but so temperamental and so sort of mercurial, which is a word that he loved to use in his writings.
Right.
But
yeah, I just want to
sure.
This is actually a funny quote from his wife. His wife said about him, she said she detested his touch. So that goes to show what kind of a guy we're talking about here.
They did not actually last, unfortunately. As much as I'd love to say that they had a happily ever after, they did eventually split up, which is unfortunate. But he was born in 1812, so right at the cusp of the War of 1812, which was our last great war with Britain here. But he grew up in relative comfort for his first decade or so. But unfortunately, about the time he turned 12, his father, who was also a very frivolous spender, became overwhelmed by his own debt. And in the midst of a Christmas season, his father was arrested and taken away to debtor's prison, which was something that was very common at that time. And the problem with debtor's prison is that there was no way in prison to really work off your debt, so your family had to do it for you. And the only one who could do it was young Charlie Dickens. And so he ended up going to a bootblack factory. Bootblacks basically making shoe polish. It was vats full of filthy chemicals. It was noxious, and the conditions were grim. And this changed the course of young Charles Dickens' life. This would change him forever. He worked there for 3 years, and for a 12-year-old, that's an eternity, first of all.
Yeah, he was actually pulled out of school as well to do it too, which is saying a lot. They pulled his little kid out of school so he could go work at a blacking factory, which had to be horrible.
Absolutely horrifying. The conditions there were abysmal, and he didn't get to go home at the end of the day and sleep in his own bed. His house was gone. His belongings had been sold off along with the rest of his families. He lived there. He was essentially imprisoned. So it was a grim life. He was subject to abuse. Victorian workhouses were a little better than prisons. Children were subject to squalid living conditions, punishing work hours, and no freedom whatsoever. It was entirely a joyless life. And those painful and bleak early years would very much define his life and his work, from the plight of orphans, which he portrays in Oliver Twist, about a young boy in a workhouse, to, of course, the miserly character of Ebenezer Scrooge, who would become not only his greatest character, but his greatest work. And so this was the early life of Charles Dickens. And it's funny because I think we often forget or many people just don't know what an incredibly difficult early life he had, because he became so famous and really did very well financially later in life. It's hard to imagine that he came from the absolute gutters and was very, very in touch with the kinds of characters that he tended to write about in his stories.
Yeah, I mean, he was able to go back to school whenever his father was released from debtor's prison. I believe that his uncle passed away, and they got some sort of minor inheritance or whatever, and they paid for his dad to get out. But it had to be, like you said, to know about the background of the author really does bring these works to life, because we talk about the Artful Dodger, or we talk about any of these great characters. I'm sure he knew these people personally. He knew who these people were, and he simply brought them to life with his pen.
Oh, very much so. And it changed his perspective on the world as well, because it changed his perspective, even though, as I say, so much of his life, other than those dark years, so much of his life was in comparative comfort. He wasn't when he was home with his family, when his father was finally out of prison again, he had a decent enough home life. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable enough. But despite this, he never saw himself as, above other people. He always considered himself to be a common man. And this became, it became a very important part of his writings. And again, you see it in Oliver Twist. You see it in, books like Little Dorrit. You see examples of it in almost everything that he wrote. There's always elements of this class warfare between the powerful and the weak. And it became very crucial to what he wrote. But because of his great success with books like the Pickwick Papers, which was one of the very first things that he published, Oliver Twist, people tended to imagine that he was untouchable at that point, that Dickens was, he threw lavish dinner parties, he had a beautiful house, but he was not unlike his father in many ways. And unfortunately, his frivolous spending did end up getting him into some pretty desperate financial straits. And by the beginning of 1843, he was looking at financial ruin if something didn't change very fast. He had just published a disastrously badly reviewed book called Martin Chuzzlewit. It was a great name, but which did not do well at all. And his previous two books had not been particularly successful either. So his publishers weren't particularly anxious for his next work. He didn't have any money coming in. He was becoming indebted to loan officers. And so things were beginning to look pretty bleak for our hero, Mr. Dickens, at that point.
That's right. Yes. Now, I will tell you, right before he wrote A Christmas Carol, and this kind of ties in with my neck of the woods, he decided he was going to take what they were taking then is the Grand Tour, right, of America. And he took a boat. I believe he got off at Philadelphia. He took the canal over to Pittsburgh, and then he studied the prison system at Western Penitentiary in Pittsburgh. And after he left Pittsburgh and went back home, then he immediately started to write A Christmas Carol. So there's a little bit of Pittsburgh in A Christmas Carol.
I can imagine that. And I'm sure that Pittsburgh had slums just like anywhere else. And these are things that really, really affected him.
Yeah. That's a great point, because you'd also have immigrants at this time as well, too. And not only that, he was for the first time confronted with the idea of slavery. He was able to see things like this firsthand, hear from the abolitionists that were talking on the streets, and that affected him very much as well, too, and even wrote about the disparity between what human beings in America.
Now, with financial ruin, basically, at least if not on the horizon for him, financial ruin was beginning to be a specter, in his closet, and this brought a lot of his memories back, his dark memories of his childhood, of the fear and the time there. And this, I think, is one of the, sort of the real sparks that ended up lighting the fire under what would become A Christmas Carol. Now, initially, basically haunted by his cold and hungry years in the workhouse, fear of falling into poverty haunted him, and he was 31. He was only 31 years old in 1843. He had multiple children at that point. I believe at that point he had at least 5 children, and he would go on to sire quite a few more. But he began to envision writing a manifesto, and a manifesto that would expose all of this corruption, all of this, the sort of the rich feeding off of the poor, getting rich on the backs of the poor, the conditions of the poor and the workhouses, because people didn't understand. And this manifesto for him became a real sort of a passion project. But he was also facing potential disaster. And so he began to wonder, is there a way to combine these two ideas? Is there a way that this manifesto and a book that was saleable to the general public could come to pass? And in October of 1843, he had an epiphany. He needed a new book to solve his financial woes, and he had something important he felt he needed to say to the world. And it occurred to him that these two ideas might be merged into something unexpected. And that unexpected thing was Ebenezer Scrooge, who would become, as I say, the greatest character in all of Dickens' work and one of the greatest characters in all of fiction. Ebenezer Scrooge, of course, represented, that sort of class of people who had wealth but wouldn't give it to anyone, who basically hoarded all the wealth to themselves, didn't enjoy any of it. These people who had, I've always wondered this as myself, as a personal thing, and as someone who does not have a tremendous amount of money, is that doesn't it seem sometimes that no matter how wealthy people are, the wealthier they are, the more miserable they are? Look at watch any news broadcast, and you see some of the wealthiest people in the world, people like Elon Musk, people like Donald Trump, all of these people who are just angry at the world and so aggressive all the time. And yet these people have enough money to do anything they want and be comfortable, as well as future generations, for the rest of their lives. And this idea truly poisoned Dickens' mind. He couldn't imagine why these people existed, and he wanted to write a story about such a man, and this man would become Ebenezer Scrooge.
Yeah, Mary Beth said she asked a great question. I would love to see what he would have make of the world today. And I think we can read between the lines and know what he would make of the world today, just simply by the way his characters talk to one another.
That's actually true of a lot of authors. I think we may have discussed this a little bit. I'm not sure if we brought it up when we did our program on Washington Irving on Halloween night. We did our Headless Horseman, because Washington Irving had a very similar perspective. He was a sort of a traditionalist, and he wanted the world to stay simple. He wanted people to have a good, simple life. And later in life, about 30 years after Washington Irving wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and wrote all about the wonderful, quaint country customs of the Hudson Valley that he loved so much, in that story, he had written that it was nice that Sleepy Hollow had stayed, sort of traditional, while the rest of the world moved on and sort of, grew out of control. And in later years, he actually ended up writing a story when he talked about the fact that the world had not gone in the direction he wanted to, that it had just become all the more, everything was fast. Nobody had time for anything to just sit down and enjoy dinner together. And it sounds so familiar to us today, because when we talk about this modern world with people glued to their screens, looking at their phones all the time, not looking up at the world, I think we see that. And I think that we see that with Dickens as well. Dickens, who believed that this utopian society could happen and that people could grow and could change. And I think that he would have hoped that would have carried on and maybe had a better impact. And I think in some ways it has, but not enough, surely.
Right. And Scrooge is still part of our vernacular. We use it all the time, and this person is a Scrooge. So we still see the world very much through the way Dickens had envisioned it himself.
We did. And, Dickens' idea initially was fascinating, because he came up with this idea. And like so many authors of his time, you have to understand that much of this was just compiled from the things he saw around him, that he probably knew people that were very much like Ebenezer Scrooge. He probably knew people that were like the Cratchits, all of these different people. And so he sort of transformed them and made them characters into his book, but they weren't really fictional so much as they were interpretations of things that he was seeing in his life. And he came up with this idea in what he called Stave One, because A Christmas Carol, of course, is a reference to a song or a ballad, and a stave being a piece of music. So all of the different chapters of A Christmas Carol are called the staves. So the first stave, Jacob Marley. Jacob Marley was Ebenezer Scrooge's business partner, and these two had a very, very lucrative money changing house. Basically, they were loan sharks, and that they would loan money to people and expect tremendous interest on these loans. And when the people inevitably couldn't pay them back, they would have them sent to debtors' prisons. So they were seen as these two heartless, ruthless characters. And as A Christmas Carol opens, we find that Scrooge, is sort of ruminating on the fact that Jacob Marley is now dead. That he has died. Scrooge doesn't have any particular emotional connection to this. He was his partner. He actually signs the death certificate for Marley, because Marley didn't have anyone who loved him or cared about him. And if he had any family, they weren't interested anymore. So basically the two had only one another. And now that Marley is dead, Scrooge is alone in the world, and he's just fine with that. He doesn't want companionship. He doesn't want anything. I think that, that Dickens describes him as carrying his own cold temperature around with him anywhere he goes, and that he cools a room in summer and doesn't get one jot warmer in the winter. I mean, just meant to be this icy, compassionless man.
Right. And the juxtaposition there is amazing and very beautiful as well, too, because the people are very alone in debtor's prison, but somebody cast them there. Now, Scrooge is in his own prison of his own making. He's by himself, and he's really chained to his money. I mean, that is the whole idea of this, that the people that are in prison are somewhat more free than Scrooge is himself.
And at an early scene in the story, a couple of people arrive at Scrooge's office, and they're collecting charities for the poor. They say, obviously at this time of year that want is deeply felt, and they're hoping to get a small donation for the poor who don't have enough money to even buy food and drink. And Scrooge, just callously turns them away. And when they specifically say, but what about these people who literally, have nowhere to go? He says, are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? Mm-hmm. And he seems delighted at the idea that his taxes pay for that, and that's good enough for those people. And it's just this incredibly cold and harsh perspective. But something I love to point out, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit because it's going to come up later, but what I love to point out is that I think many people interpret Ebenezer Scrooge as a mean and evil man, and he's neither of those things. He's not trying to be mean. He's not interested in people suffering at all. He just can't find it in himself to care. Mm-hmm. He's not mean, he's bitter. He's not evil, he's cold. He's this detached person who's just lost all of the love in his heart. And that's the whole point of this character, is that he just doesn't understand the world that he lives in and lives apart from it. He's this isolated creature. I think actually Dickens calls him solitary as an oyster. And because he was a wordsmith. But it's a wonderful, wonderful description of this person who's just held himself out from the decency of the world and no longer even understands it.
Right. And we do see flashbacks, so we won't jump the gun, but we do see flashbacks whenever he was younger, that he did have love in his heart and he could feel attraction for other people, but that was all wasted away.
Yeah. So the ghost of Jacob Marley shows up and basically says to Scrooge, look at where I am in life. Now, Marley, when we meet him, he's the most traditional ghost in this story. In a way, he is the traditional ghost. He's semi-transparent. He passes through doors. He has these chains that rattle behind him. And when we think of rattling chains and things like that, I think that we're often thinking of Jacob Marley, who kind of created that idea, or at the very least made it common public knowledge. But Jacob Marley isn't simply carrying chains. He is fettered. He is actually chained and wrapped in the fetters that he created in his own life. And these are the fetters of his misdeeds, of his lack of compassion. He's got locks and safety deposit boxes, and all the things that were important to him have now become these fetters that have dragged him down and are basically keeping him chained to the earth. And what Marley says to Scrooge is that, this is my fate, but I'm dead. You've still got a chance. There's a possibility, thanks to me, I have gotten a possibility for you to have some redemption here. And he tries his best to convince Scrooge that there is redemption potentially to be had. And Scrooge is having none of it. Scrooge isn't interested in this because he doesn't believe that there's anything wrong with him. Scrooge believes that he is a good man of business. And when he says this to Marley, he says, "You were always a good man of business." Marley screams out, business, mankind was my business. Charity and forbearance were my business. Humanity was my business. And it's a powerful moment, but the ghost of Jacob Marley is meant to be terrifying. He's meant to be terrifying. Hi, Dolly. I don't know if we've had you on board before, but I'm very welcome to have you here. So thanks for coming aboard. So yes, he's meant to be a terrifying ghost because he has got to scare Scrooge into a sort of a degree of pliability. He's meant to give Scrooge the fear of death so that he will actually become receptive to the message. And so the ghost of Jacob Marley is really the most specifically terrifying moment in the story. Of course, as you see here, you initially see him as the door knocker when Scrooge, who's not a particularly superstitious man, walks home alone on Christmas Eve, unlocks the door to his cold, empty, dark house, and sees the door knocker take on the shape of Jacob Marley. Later, when we meet, Jacob, and he actually comes into the room and tells Scrooge, that he's going to send 3 spirits to visit him throughout the course of the night. He doesn't specifically say why. He simply says that this is meant for your well-being, his well-being, or I don't remember the specific word he uses. But then he ultimately, the ghost says, your reclamation, basically to bring you back to the world and bring you back to life. And Scrooge still isn't buying much of any of it, and eventually goes and hides under his covers, assuming that he's had a nightmare, which he refers to as caused by indigestion. He says it's an underdone bit of potato or a bad piece of beef that gave him his vision of Jacob Marley. And so it's a good start and a very, very spooky beginning to the story. So round about 1 a.m., the Scrooge, who now, of course, believes that this entire thing was just a bit of indigestion and hallucination, he sees a streaming light coming through the curtains of his 4-poster bed. He basically keeps his room ice cold, and the bed's probably the only thing that's keeping him from freezing to death. But he sees a gleaming light peeking through the bed curtains, and when he opens the bed curtains, he sees a truly bizarre apparition. The Ghost of Christmas Past. It's an embodiment of the memories which haunt our lives, and the stakes and choices which shape us, and the things which we wish we could change. And it's interesting because the description of the Ghost of Christmas Past is not male or female. It's this sort of strange chimeric creature which, as Scrooge watches it, becomes a man, it becomes a woman, it becomes young, it becomes old, it's small, it's large. He refers to it as appearing as he watches it to sort of recede away into the distance, but also come closer. It's this mercurial, and again, I'm using that word, but this creature that has no definition. The one specific thing about it, however, is that it glows with this light, which is meant to be virtually unbearable. And I believe, symbolically speaking, this is meant to be unbearable to Scrooge, because this is the light of life. This is the light of his past and the light of life, which he's closed himself off to in this world of darkness. And so to him, the ghost is blinding. And the very first thing he wants to do, and he specifically asks the ghost to put out its own light. And it's a wonderful moment because, symbolically speaking, what he's saying is, I'm not interested in what you have to sell. I want to stay here in the darkness. Obviously, the ghost has none of it, thankfully, or else we wouldn't have much of an adventure.
Yeah, almost like an angelic visitation with this particular ghost.
Yes, it's meant to be it's meant to look beautiful and, unearthly, and exactly that, sort of an angelic figure. And so the ghost, carries Scrooge away. And actually, I have to point something out first, because I skipped over an important moment that happens with Jacob Marley just before all of this happens. Just before Jacob Marley leaves Scrooge and to wait for his first ghostly visitor, he calls him over to the window. And he looks out the window along with Scrooge and shows him that the sky is filled with ghosts. And they're all fettered. They're all covered in chains and sort of weighed down. And many of them are clustered around a homeless woman and her child, who are curled up in a corner of an alley. It's snowing out there. It's clearly freezing, and this woman has nowhere to go. And the ghosts are surrounding her and lamenting because they can't help her, because they've lost the ability to do that. And this is kind of that last moment when Marley explains to Scrooge that, this is your fate, potentially, if you don't do something now. If you don't basically listen to what me and my, sort of cohorts have to say, is basically spending the rest of eternity wondering what you could have done differently.
Right, right. And that's a good point too. It's also an insight into the way London was at the time, because there was it was expensive. Even a tenement was expensive, so you had a great homeless population there as well. And every morning there would be a dispatch of somebody from the police force that would go through the parks to find the dead bodies that were on the benches or under trees or what have you. And there's, you can read this, the contemporary accounts of them finding babies just dead, in the park because they froze to death overnight. This was a very, very hideous place. And again, Scrooge is isolated from that, right? He has to look through a window. He has to be shown that what's already in plain sight, he's blind to it until somebody, casts a proverbial light on what's going on around him.
Even before any of the first ghosts show up, well before anything else happens, before Scrooge leaves his office for the evening, his nephew Fred comes to visit him, and his nephew invites him to dinner. And Scrooge turns him away and says, "I'm not interested in coming to dinner with you. I'd rather, basically, I'd rather burn in hell first." And it's a really harsh reaction. It seems out of keeping, and you don't understand why at that time. But he says to his nephew, who's just literally just come to invite him to dinner, he says, Christmas is a humbug. Basically, it's nonsense. It's worthless. And he says, what has Christmas ever done for you? And Fred says to him, it's never put a penny in my pocket, but I believe it's a good time. It is a valuable time. And he says something which I think is in many ways the single most powerful, sort of set of lines in the entire book. It happens just in that very first opening pages. He says, "I've always believed that Christmas is a good time when people open their shut up hearts and look upon their fellow man as if they are fellow travelers to the grave, not a race of other people." And it's the idea of, again, he's saying to Scrooge, the people that are out there are valuable. They have value. Scrooge treats everyone as though they're worthless unless they're going to make him a profit. And it's just this wonderful moment where he says, listen, you have to look out there and see the value in people and see the value in life. But it's, again, a thing that Scrooge has no interest in. Right. So when the ghost of Christmas past shows up, he says to the ghost, he says, "Are you the ghost of Christmas long past?" Because he doesn't believe all this. He thinks still thinks the whole thing's a dream. And he says, "No, I'm the ghost of your past," and whisks him away to see some of his childhood. And we are treated to a sort of a series, kind of a montage of Scrooge's childhood. We see the school where he was a young boy, and Scrooge immediately lights up when he sees some of his old schoolmates going by in a sleigh and playing on a snowy day outside the village where he went to school. And you see that very first spark of the real Scrooge underneath it all. And then he fast forwards a few years, and you find that Scrooge is still in the school on Christmas Eve alone. Everyone else has gone home for the holiday, and you learn that Scrooge's father won't take him home because you very quickly learn that Scrooge's older sister Fanny, I'm sorry, apologize, we're jumping the gun here and I'm crossing some characters, that Scrooge, his mother passed away in childbirth. So Scrooge basically, in his father's eyes, Scrooge was the death of his own mother. And so the father wants nothing to do with him and basically has, imprisoned young Scrooge, who's just a boy, at this school. And you begin to see the beginning of the decline of this young man. But they fast forward a few more years and have his sister come to get him at school and say that father's willing to bring you home now, that he's kinder than he used to be. And you get this little flash of happiness, little bright sort of moment. But obviously this doesn't last. Scrooge ends up being sent away to an apprenticeship, and that the whole thing is very temporary. And every time Scrooge gets close to love, as you see in these early years of his life, something in some way seems to snatch it away from him. And, and he is left alone again. And this begins to form what will become the miser he becomes, as the story moves on, that we meet in the beginning.
Yes. So these little vignettes are showing, what could have been, or what should have been, let's put it that way, because like other children at this particular time, they were having their innocence taken away from them. So even though he was of privilege and was having a schooling, just like the children at the workhouse, he still had no joy within his life.
Exactly. In fact, you learn, and we're talking earlier about Mr. Fezziwig, that that when he was apprenticed, he actually went to apprentice for a place called Fezziwig's, and Mr. Fezziwig's warehouse. Nothing particularly special about the warehouse, except that Mr. Fezziwig is portrayed to be this kind, jovial, wonderful fellow, and he and his wife every year throw a huge Christmas party for all their employees. And you see Scrooge there at the Christmas party, enjoying himself, and he just seems so excited. And Elder Scrooge, now watching all of this, through the ghost's visions, Elder Scrooge basically is, clearly excited by this. He's loving seeing this, moment from his past. And the ghost says, what are you getting so excited about? I mean, this is nothing, right? It's, your boss basically spent 2 or 3 pounds, I mean, how is that worth any kind of praise? And Scrooge looks at him and he says, it wasn't about the money. He had the power to make us happy with just a simple word or a simple gesture. Something so small was so important to us. And at that point, the ghost looks at him again and says, what's that in your eye? Indicating that Scrooge has a tear in his eye. And Scrooge says to him, oh, nothing, it's nothing. And the ghost says, yeah, just fess up. Tell me what's on your mind. And he says, I just like to have a word with my clerk right now, because, of course, his own clerk, Bob Cratchit, is under Scrooge's thumb. He makes barely any money whatsoever. And Scrooge is a monster to him. And, again, we begin to see the cracks in that facade. So it's a really wonderful moment. And then it leads up to the moment that breaks Scrooge in this sort of first section of it, where you see that at this party is the girl that he has fallen in love with, Belle. And Belle loves him back. And the two of them obviously, are deeply, deeply in love. And as time wears on, you get to see a cute couple more flashes of them in their lives until you learn that Scrooge's desire for wealth and his desire for security, basically his fear of being, in poverty and, sort of going back to where he began, it's preyed on him too much. And you see him becoming this bitter man. And eventually Belle, the woman he loves more than anyone in the world, comes to him and says, I'm not going to try and hold you in this marriage or hold you in this, to this engagement, because I don't have a nickel to my name. And you know that if you met me today, you would never pursue me because I don't have a dowry to bring to the marriage. And she basically says, you've become this cold, lifeless thing, and I release you from your obligation to me. And Scrooge can't even find it in himself to say, please give me another chance. He basically says, well, if that's the way you feel, then I guess you have to go. And it's just this moment where you realize that he really has just become this creature of ice. And so it's a very dark moment. But in the present tense, our older Scrooge, viewing all of this, sees this and is just heartbroken by it and demands that the ghost bring him home. And in fact, grabs the candle snuffer that the ghost carries with it, because the ghost, as I say, basically this beacon of light, and sort of snuffs the ghost light out before he is returned to his own bedroom. So it's a very, very powerful moment, and kind of the midpoint of the entire story. It's kind of that peak that Scrooge gets to.
Yeah, absolutely. Now the next part is my favorite part.
It really is. It's wonderful. So it doesn't take very long. Scrooge doesn't get a chance to even close his eyes, still convincing himself that the whole thing is a nightmare, when once again he hears a racket from the other room and is summoned by the next ghost, the ghost of Christmas Present. And the ghost of Christmas Present has this wonderful sort of jovial appearance. He's portly. He's wearing this big fur-lined robe and the big beard, holly around his head, and he's sitting atop this mountain of food and gifts and all the sort of wonders of Christmas. And in fact, once again, the room is so sparkling and bright that Scrooge can barely stand it. And it's very distinct that the description of this character is really a lot like what we think of as Father Christmas, St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, what have you. And in fact, I think the description was so much so that I think it's interesting that in the early illustrations, a wonderful artist, Victorian artist by the name of John Leach, did the illustrations for the very original edition. And based on the little bit that he knew, because he didn't have the whole book to work with, he actually portrayed the ghost of Christmas Present in this big scarlet red robe with the white fur, very much like the Father Christmas character. And unfortunately, that wasn't how Dickens had actually described him. He was specific that the robe had been of sort of this deep green color, and he did end up having to change it before it went to publication. But I think it's wonderful to see that this original illustration and its coloring, which was hand done by John Leach, still does exist. But the final illustration that made it into the book did portray him in the green robe, this kind of very, very pagan sort of Yule Lord character, who is the figure of all things jolly and all things, all things Christmas and all things wonderful. And he goes on to bring Scrooge through the streets today, like in the modern time, and show him all the various things that he's missing. He gets to see people, in their homes partying with all their family and their loved ones. He gets to see people, homeless people, or people out in at sea on ships that have nothing but a cold tankard of beer to keep them warm on this cold night, but they're still singing Christmas carols. And he begins to see that this spirit of joy is everywhere except within Scrooge's heart. And it becomes a very, very powerful sort of a lesson, again, where Scrooge doesn't believe that joy can find its way into the darkness, and yet he's seeing it everywhere. And so you're right, it's a wonderful sequence, and probably one of the most joyful sequences in the entire book.
That's right. And there's also the one scene where the miners are taking a bit of a drink in the mine. They don't even know what time it is or anything. They just can sense that it's Christmas time. It kind of imbues the entire world around him, and he's the only one not getting it.
And then comes again the pivotal moment, the moment that begins to, again, push Scrooge over the edge, which is when the ghost of Christmas Present shows him the Cratchit household, Bob Cratchit being again his clerk, who pays a pittance. And Scrooge doesn't really know anything about Cratchit's life. He's never bothered to ask. And he goes and he sees the Cratchit household, and he sees the family sort of bustling around preparing for Christmas. He sees that they have a very meager meal. They have a skinny, underfed goose that looks like it could barely feed one person, never mind a family of 5. He sees that they've got basically, not much more than a saucer full of brandy for their Christmas, for their Christmas toast, and everything is very small, and yet they seem so full of love and full of joy. And at that time, Bob Cratchit arrives home with his little boy on his shoulder, and we meet Tiny Tim for the first time. And Tiny Tim, I think, culturally has become kind of a joke, and he's been made fun of in so many different versions of the story, and yet he's really such a profound little character, because he's a sick little boy who's still so full of love that he can't even see his own illness. And you see the love the family has for him, but the clear implication that this boy is not long for the world. And that begins to affect Scrooge as well, who asks the ghost, he says, will the boy live? And the ghost says to him, if these events are not altered by the future, that I see an empty chair and a crutch carefully preserved. So really emotional moment at that point, when we realize that if something doesn't change, that Tiny Tim won't live. So this is a big moment where Scrooge is going over the hill, and just kind of the last moments of the Ghost of Christmas Present. But just before he leaves him, the Ghost of Christmas Present is he's scolding him a little bit for not even knowing anything about his own clerk's life and the trials that he faces. And Scrooge notices what almost looks like a claw poking out from underneath the ghost's robe, and he says, "What is that?" And the ghost parts his robe and shows 2 skinny, children dressed in rags clinging to his legs. And he says to Scrooge, Scrooge says to him, "Are they yours?" And the ghost says, "They're yours. These are mankind's children. This child is ignorance, and this girl is want, and they will basically destroy you. And beware them both, but beware the boy most, ignorance, because this is what will destroy you." And again, just this incredible social commentary. And at that point, Scrooge notices that the ghost has gone gray. He's looking very frail, and he says, "My life is literally 1 year. I come to life, for Christmas night, and then the next year my brother will be here, my brother after that." And at that point, the ghost expires, and Scrooge is left waiting for his final fate, which is, of course, we all know, one of the darkest chapters of the story. Mm-hmm. So after revisiting both his own troubled past and seeing the joy so many experience at Christmas, Scrooge is finally forced to confront his own mortality and the third spirit. Now, this spirit is the spirit of Christmas yet to come, a silent, unspeaking phantom, and it takes Scrooge through the ultimate consequences of his actions, ripples of which will affect everyone around him, as well, of course, as spell out his own grim fate. And this is an interesting point in the story, because this is where the history of the writing of this story takes a little bit of a turn, because there was never a guarantee by any means. In fact, I don't believe that Dickens originally intended that Scrooge would be redeemed. Dickens' original idea was to portray the consequences of being this kind of person, basically, the grim fate that was before you. And so the truth is that his original image was the idea that Scrooge would pay the cost of his crimes and be damned. He would die unloved, and as a consequence, so would Tiny Tim. And Tiny Tim would kind of the last nail in his coffin. The Tiny Tim, the tragic death of Cratchit, basically the ailing son of Scrooge's clerk, would loom large, and it would be the moment when Scrooge would realize that he had damned himself. And this idea was so bleak, so completely grim, that even Dickens' publishers said, listen, not going to do this. We're not going to publish this. This is, you've basically already want to write a Christmas book about a holiday that nobody really cares about, and now have this grim, awful ending. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, and the Muppets would not touch this version.
No, definitely not. And so what Dickens did is he said, fine, I'll publish it myself. And he decided that he was going to add to his own debt, take out an additional loan, and publish the book for himself, which is unheard of, absolutely unheard of. And at this point, it's worth noting that he wanted to do this within about 6 weeks. He came up with the idea for this in October, and he had less than 6 weeks to get the book written, get the illustrations done, get everything to the press, if he was going to get it to a publisher in time to be out for Christmas. And that was still absolutely cutting it to the last possible second. But he had to, because unlike some of us, he didn't have the luxury of saying, well, if I don't get it out this year, I'll get it out next year, because by next year, at that point, he was going to be in the poorhouse himself, and he wanted nothing to do with that. And so I don't know where the moment of real epiphany was with him, but at some point he realized that there was a redemption for Scrooge, that there could be. So Scrooge sees his looming death as the spirit conducts him to his own graveside. He's dying unloved and forgotten, with nothing to show for it on this earth. And this is the moment when Scrooge changes. He has this sort of split second change, and it's not meant to be split second. It's just meant to be the sort of bursting of the dam at this point. And what Scrooge says is that, if I change my ways, is there a chance that this will get better? Is it a chance that I will live? And more specifically, more importantly, will Tiny Tim live? And that's the moment. That's your magic moment right there. It's when he realizes that he has more concern for another human being than he does for himself. And that's the moment where we find some redemption from Scrooge. And it was kind of Dickens' redemption in many ways. I mean, basically, as I say, thankfully for us all and for the legacy of Christmas, Scrooge did indeed thwart his fate and reclaim his soul. But in the process, I think Dickens found his redemption with the bitterness that he had from his past and this anger that he carried about the condition of the world. It was his moment of real hope, because, to be honest, most of his stories prior to that hadn't been the happiest. Yes, Oliver Twist ends up getting kind of a fairy tale ending, but it doesn't change the world for the other orphans in that. And so many of his books had bleak, really, really grim endings, Great Expectations, Bleak House, ironically named, and things like that. And so this was this great moment of hope. But the problem now was that, would he be able to get this book out in time to save his own world? And that was the thing that I don't think anybody really believed could happen. Now, I mentioned earlier that John Leach, a wonderful, wonderful illustrator, had been tasked with doing the illustrations for this, and he was a bear to work with as well. But he needed to do 8 completely original illustrations based basically on just Dickens' notes, because Dickens hadn't even finished the book at this point, and the clock was ticking down. So Leach was not really willing to do it. Thankfully, Dickens had a lot of name and he had a lot of clout, and eventually managed to convince him to do it. And he did. And these turned out to be some of the most stunning illustrations. We've seen a couple of them as we've gone through this evening. But these were the original 8 hand-colored illustrations, which is amazing. And by some crazy twist of fate, he got the book out. He delivered the manuscript with literally hours to spare to a printer who could get the last chapters printed. And on December 19th, just 6 days until Christmas. Is today the 19th? Look at that. I didn't even need to do that intentionally.
Oh my goodness.
On December 19th of 1843, he the book appeared in bookshops, and it was that beautiful little edition that I showed you earlier with the red cloth cover. It had green end papers, gilding on it. I mean, this was a miracle. And the worst part about it was that he had spent so much money to get this book done that it had to be a success or he was going to be ruined.
Yeah. It's a Christmas miracle.
It was a Christmas miracle. Less than a week before Christmas, and every copy sold out by Christmas Eve.
Wow.
I mean, it literally is a Christmas miracle. I think it's one of the greatest Christmas stories of all time. The Christmas Carol, but even the fact that Dickens' own sort of life and the way it came to be written in a lot of ways mirrors A Christmas Carol. Now, I have to tell you that at least some of my inspiration for tonight's show came from a movie that I absolutely... No, they didn't have color printing, Mary Beth. Believe it or not, these were hand-colored pages. It's an amazing thing, the fact that they were able to get it done. You'll notice if you look at the original illustrations, the coloring isn't super detailed. It's fairly simple, but it was hand-colored illustrations, which is a remarkable thing. So it was a different time, and I don't think that they published 10,000 copies or something like that. I don't know what the original print run was. It was not big, but it was enough to truly establish Dickens as the master and bring him back from the brink, which is remarkable. Now, I was about to say that one of my big inspirations for tonight's show is a movie that I have loved for many years. Came out back in 2017, so I guess not all that many years. But if you haven't seen it and you want a good version of A Christmas Carol that's not quite a Christmas Carol, but it is, you should check out The Man Who Invented Christmas. Now, this is a fictionalized, kind of a romanticized version of the origin of Charles Dickens writing A Christmas Carol, but it's done in such a wonderful, charming, and brilliant way that the story of A Christmas Carol is told via Dickens' life and connection to it. And it has an amazing cast. It has Dan Stevens, who I think we all love in everything. It has Christopher Plummer. It has this Jonathan Pryce, all these fantastic actors in this. And it tells, again, it's a fictionalized and romanticized version of it, but it tells the story of Dickens creating the book and actually tells the story of A Christmas Carol through it. And it's one of my favorite sort of crazy reinterpretations. And if you have not seen it, I would highly recommend it. Now, I have a couple of favorite versions of A Christmas Carol, traditional versions that I'd like to recommend, but do you have any particular version that you love more than any other?
You know what? I do like the Muppets version. I do like the Muppets very much. George C. Scott's version, I like that very much as well, too. And I think whenever you talk about Patrick Stewart, I think you have to go with Patrick Stewart as well.
You know, I have to admit to you, I love Patrick Stewart. He is one of my great heroes. I think he's an amazing actor. I think he's a fantastic man. That version of A Christmas Carol, I don't care for very much. I wish I could say that I did, but believe it or not, I don't particularly. And I have to blame that on the studio TNT who produced it. You know, right. They were doing a lot of fairly inexpensive TV movies at the time, so it isn't one of my favorite versions. But as you can see, I was prepared. I was right there with you with George C. Scott's 1984 version, which I think is one of the most true to the original spirit of the story. And of course, the Muppet version of A Christmas Carol. It's easy to laugh that one off. It's easy to laugh it off. It's easy to imagine that it's going to just be a silly, jokey version, and it's got that in it. But it's an amazingly wonderful and true to the story version of it. And another huge favorite of mine, which I think it's very easy for people to write off, but which I highly recommend, is the 2009 animated CGI animated version by Disney with Jim Carrey in the role of Ebenezer Scrooge. I think because Carrey himself is a comic actor and because it's a CGI film, people tend to assume that it's going to be terrible. And it has a couple of sort of over-the-top action sequences that are, sort of chase scenes that are sort of Disneyfied. But it's still the core of the story is there and told beautifully and told with a great deal of emotion. So it's become a huge favorite of mine. And it doesn't have like cute animals or any of the stuff that Disney normally throws in. It's a pretty straightforward telling, aside from those few sort of zany action scenes that are used to sort of segue between the different ghosts. So I love them at all. But if I have one version of A Christmas Carol that I love above all else, it's one that I watch every year religiously, and it is the 1951 Scrooge starring Alistair Sim. I think it's probably the most perfect interpretation of A Christmas Carol I've ever seen put on film. If you haven't seen it, you can find it for free on YouTube, and it is absolutely worth your time. I think it's one of the greatest things you can do on Christmas or Christmas Eve is watch a Christmas Carol to really sort of remind you what the spirit of Christmas is all about. So all of those, a huge recommendation for me. So there we go.
And it's genuinely scary as well, too.
It can be very, very spooky when you get the wrong ones. Especially, I think that Alistair Sim version can get very creepy, and I think the George C. Scott version has some really creepy moments too. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, just the music cues they use in it and everything. I mean, as you all folks know out there, we're big cinemaphiles here, and so we can't get very far without a movie recommendation.
That's right. That's right. And I will tell you, at whenever it was 45 minutes into the show, I thought, there's no way we're going to get through with this. So I give you a lot of credit for doing that.
Sometimes you got to push on through. But so, folks, I want to let you know that we are going to be taking a 2-week break because we do have the holiday season coming up. So we're not going to be here on the day after Christmas, and we're not going to be here on New Year's Day. We're going to take a 2-week break. So we will be back the second, I guess technically that's the second week of January, with a brand new show. Again, under our brand new heading, we are going to be Monday Night Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters. We have not yet set a program for that return yet, but we're going to have something fun for you. As always, guys, thank you so much for joining us. Hit like, hit subscribe if you aren't already subscribed. Find us online. Again, if you didn't get a chance to see the whole show tonight, we're going to be live. We're going to be on YouTube in just a little while. And on behalf of everybody here at both Dead Air Paranormal and Monday Night Monsters, Mysteries, and Myths, which I'm sure I'm going to screw up every time I say it, we just want to thank you guys all for being here and have a wonderful holiday, however you celebrate it. Ron, got big plans for the holiday?
Zero plans for the holidays besides wrapping presents for 5 children.
Well, that's all right. You know what? Sometimes that's what it's all about. So, well, I hope you have a wonderful holiday as well. And I will talk to you soon. And ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you very much. And we will see you in the future.
Happy holidays and Merry Christmas.